The Oscar-nominated director Petra Costa has a new film out on Netflix on the relationship between the evangelical church and the radical right in Brazil. It's a really excellent film. It's eye-opening. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Here's part of the trailer.
This city was designed as a vision of Brazil's future. And the cement that held it together was a faith, not in God, but instead in the equally abstract ideas of progress and democracy.
Eu quero ser pastor de uma geração que vai mudar a história.
In the last 40 years, evangelicals have grown from 5 to more than 30% of Brazil's population. A rapid religious shift molded into an unprecedented political force.
No meu voto, o que vai influenciar mesmo é a minha religião.
Somos maioria absoluta no país!
O que levou o socialismo ao fracasso foi a negação da religião.
Com verdade, nós estamos fazendo uma nova forma política no Brasil.
É que ele gosta de conversar comigo também, porque eu também sou franco para falar com ele.
Brasil, acima de tudo, Deus acima de tudo!
That was part of the trailer for Apocalypse in the Tropics. It's the follow-up to Petra Costa's Oscar-nominated film, The Edge of Democracy. The Edge of Democracy gave viewers a front-row seat to the judicial coup, which saw Dilma Rousseff kicked out of office and Lula barred from standing in the 2019 presidential election. And of course, that election was won by Bolsonaro. And this new film looks at the movement behind Bolsonaro and in particular the support it drew from evangelicals. It climaxes with the presidential election in 2022, which saw Lula return to power and Brazil's, or the ham-fisted attempt of Brazil's right at a January 6th style coup. Earlier this month, I caught up with Petra Costa to discuss the film, and I began by asking her what led her to focus on the evangelical right.
I'm Brazilian, and I'm very interested for the past 10 years in understanding what has been happening to Brazilian democracy. Brazil is the largest population of Latin America, and as you know, the future of the world depends on it because we have the Amazon most of the Amazon within our borders. So who governs Brazil also will influence how our ecosystems survive. And I went to Congress trying to understand what was happening to Brazilian democracy and was met by a pastor who asked me to accept Jesus and gave me a Bible. And the contradiction of going into the center of democracy and being evangelized or invited to be evangelized was what set me into this journey, into a rabbit hole of trying to understand how faith has been mobilized for political reasons in Brazil and around the world.
And I suppose the film documents, doesn't it, the role of the evangelical church in the rise of Bolsonaro. Do you think that we wouldn't have seen a Bolsonaro without the evangelical church having become so significant in Brazilian politics?
Yes, I think the evangelical support was crucial for Bolsonaro's election because that's the majority of the working class vote that he got in the beginning and still continued to get comes from a part of the evangelical population. As we saw in the last election, 2022, the evangelical population was this segment that most voted for him. 70% of evangelicals voted for Bolsonaro, more than in any other social-political segment. And many evangelical leaders most of the prominent evangelical leaders continue very aligned with Bolsonaro and the far right.
The film's about Brazilian politics. It's also about religion. And I suppose a question which applies in many parts of the world, really, is how different religions or different sort of, types of religion, different schools of thought can lead to different politics. And it is really interesting, isn't it, how evangelical Christianity has been so associated with the right wing. In your documentary, you sort of briefly discuss liberation theology, which was part of the Catholic Church, which was very much about, I suppose, uplifting the poor and fighting for democracy. So what is your analysis of why evangelical Christianity has been so allied with the right? Is there something doctrinal there? Is there something sort of about the belief system that means it naturally supports right-wing politics? Or is this a sort of sociological situation where it just so happens that the people at the forefront of the evangelical church have supported politicians of the right?
I think it has to do a lot with premillennialism and what I trace in the film as the origin of this thought, which is that for much time Christians believed that Jesus would return to the earth after 1,000 years of peace on earth. And John Nelson Darby, this Irish pastor, changed that in the 19th century by saying that no, actually the world was in chaos and Jesus would come back. The more things were in a state of chaos and collapse. And some fundamentalist evangelicals who come after this theology of Darby would even radicalize that to the point of saying that the end of the world must be accelerated for Jesus to return. I myself interviewed a pastor who said that very clearly. When I asked him, why did he vote for Bolsonaro? He said, well, Bolsonaro is bringing chaos in many ways, but that's good because the faster things get into the apocalypse, the faster Jesus will return. And we're seeing that in America very clearly with this end times theology being very present among Trump's allies and many people in his very close to him in his government. And it is also this idea of waging war in the Middle East has all to do with that theology of that there will be an Armageddon that must be accelerated for Jesus to return. And I was unaware that this theology was driving my national politics and world politics to such an extent.
It's disconcerting, isn't it, to have a religious movement which proactively wants chaos. I suppose a question I have is whether you have an analysis of why the evangelical church has been so successful. You point out in your movie, evangelicals went from 5% to 30% of the Brazilian population in the past 40 years. And you say it's one of the fastest religious shifts in human history. Why has the evangelical church sort of grown so dramatically in Brazil and in elsewhere? Obviously, people will know about the United States, I think also in East Asia and in many parts of the world, actually, much of Africa, the evangelical church has been on the rise. Is there something about evangelical Christianity that's particularly suited to the modern world, that it's seen as particularly attractive or particularly capable of spreading itself? What's your analysis of why it seems, I suppose, suited to the current moment, let's say?
Well, first, there's much less hierarchy. A pastor can open a church very quickly in any area. In a country like Brazil, it's very hard for a Catholic church to go to the Amazon or to remote areas of Brazil, while evangelical pastors can get formed more quickly, open a church in their own houses. And also, prosperity theology is very aligned with neoliberalism, with capitalism, with the idea that you can and should enrich yourself. That is not a sin. In Brazil, particularly, the rise of evangelicalism had a lot to do with a moment where many Brazilians were being expelled or forced out of rural areas and were encroaching in the cities, were starting to live in the favelas, and Brazil was becoming extremely unequal. And the evangelical church started to play a role also of social services, of belonging, of giving people a family in these new places. Today, what I saw in making this film was also the role they play in political formation and personal coaching. Malafaia, the pastor that we followed for 4 years, in his services, he will say, you will be the generation that will change the world. You're going to be the judges, the Supreme Court, justices, the presidents of tomorrow. Who else says that to young people today? I mean, I never heard anything like that when I was growing up. And it's powerful. It's powerful to hear something like that. And I think what is clear in Brazil, particularly, is that the place progressive movements, progressive religious movements occupied in the country's social fabric has diminished immensely. And as well as other type of social movements that do grassroots work. Most of the grassroots work are done by evangelical pastors.
Where does this analysis lead you? Because I mean, in the documentary, the evangelical church are portrayed as, you know, a malign influence really on Brazilian politics. They're supporting a politician in the shape of Bolsonaro who is offensive, flirts with dictatorship, is very anti-democratic, and is willing to put the army out onto the streets. And that's very much supported by the very powerful evangelical Christians that you are following in the film. How would a democracy-loving leftist respond to this? Does the left need a sort of religion of its own? Does it need to engage in evangelical spaces and try and take it in a different direction? I suppose, did you come away from making your film with an idea of what has to be the strategy to protect democracy in Brazil?
Well, in terms of strategy to protect democracy in Brazil and around the world is a clear understanding that the separation between church and state is at risk and under attack, and that democracy is a living thing and not take it for granted, and that it's urgent to establish mechanisms in our democracies that will protect the separation of church and state. And that and control the influence of religion over politics, of religious leaders in political campaigns. Also, an understanding that there are, of course, millions of evangelical followers who are not happy with this, that are not happy that their leaders are making so many services about politics and also persecuting religious followers who are not aligned with their political vision, as the pastor that I show in the film, who was expelled from his church and also persecuted for declaring that he would not vote in Bolsonaro. That is the case with many other pastors. That there are many pastors who are progressive, evangelical pastors who are progressive in Brazil, but that are under attack. And that is clearly a consequence of this attack on the separation of church and state. That's what happens. And that's the reason why Christians invented the separation of church and state. I was amazed to discover that it was not an atheist who invented that separation. It was Christians to stop centuries of religious wars, because that's the religious will be the first to be attacked once there is a state religion.
I want to talk about the connection between well, I'm not sure if it was your first film, actually. Let's say your last film, The Edge of Democracy, and this most recent film, because the theme of The Edge of Democracy was very much sort of the judicial judicial coup against Lula and Dilma. And in that, I felt like sort of the separation of powers was posited as, you know, to some degree malign. And the courts were to some degree malign. In your second movie, the courts play a much more, I suppose, they're presented as playing a much more positive role in terms of limiting the unconstrained power of Bolsonaro, who wants to take the country back into a dictatorship. Have your views on the courts sort of changed in the period of making both of these movies?
The Brazilian court went through a lot of self-criticism in the past few years. During the years that I was filming The Edge of Democracy, there was the car wash operation was done in a moment where there was this idea that the public ministry would rid Brazil of corruption, even if it had to disrespect the presumption of innocence and the rule of law. After that, many things happened, but mainly Vaza Jato, which were these leaks that showed Judge Sérgio Moro conspiring with the prosecutor, Deltan Dallagnol, to imprison Lula with the clear objective of not allowing him to win the presidential election. Then, as this judge went on to become Justice Minister of Bolsonaro, making the plot even more evident. After that, the Supreme Court went through a moment of deep self-criticism for its unconditional support of an operation that was clearly disrespecting the rule of law. So as I say, democracy is a living thing. Brazil went through a punitivist moment. Of course, there was corruption, and there were great things that happened after car wash, like forbidding companies to fund political campaigns. That was a direct consequence of that. But as any living thing, it self-regulates when it's healthy. And that's what I believe happened in the courts.
What direction do you see Brazilian politics going in? Obviously, sort of when you were making your first movie, it was quite a dark movie, right? Because democracy was being threatened by this judicial coup against Dilma and Lula. Your second movie, in a way, or even darker, right? Because it's about the evangelical church and Bolsonaro really threatening democracy. At the same time, it's being released at a time when Lula is in power, Bolsonaro did lose. There was it wasn't quite a peaceful transition of power, but there was a transition of power. What direction do you see Brazilian politics going in?
It's so unpredictable. It can go in any direction. But what is clear is that the far right has a strong wind blowing in this current zeitgeist around the world, because I believe many people that democracy is failing us, that neoliberalism is broken, that our leaders are trying to lead us into apocalypse or have no instruments to stop it. And so we need a fix in the system globally. We need a fix in the system to be able to become healthy democracies again.